Well, good morning, friends. Well, first of all, I just have to say how awesome it is to have a bunch of musicians and vocalists who are all part of this church, and it just reminds me that worship truly is the work of the people. And so I just want to celebrate our volunteers and everybody who makes worship happen. So I'm Andrew Henderson. If I haven't met you, I'm the worship arts director here, and for context, this here is my comfort zone right here. And so when Tyler asked me to preach today, I'm stepping out of it. But before I go on, why don't we just take a beat and take a couple of deep breaths, maybe settle into your seat, and take a moment and make a point to be present here in this place with these people. A few years ago, I was depressed. And I attribute that to a few different things. There was a pandemic happening in the world you might have read about, and there was a lot of social isolation that went along with that. There was also a lot of uncertainty and change in the church. And my family's sweet dog, Evie, Michelle's and my first venture into joint ownership before we even got married had just died. And I wasn't taking care of myself. And so I was at a low point, and that last one, you could argue that might have been the cause, that might have been the effect. But so I was feeling low, so here's what I did. First step, work long hours. Work long hours as long as I could stand. And then with what little time was left, I found that the best strategy was just a slow, constant influx of food and drink and internet media until my body just kind of shut down for the day. That was the best strategy. And that really helped. I felt a lot better after that. No, of course not. I was distracting myself. I was using these things as pacifiers. And I think, as far as the media goes, I was just taking whatever the culture put in front of me and absorbing it. And through all these things, I was creating and reinforcing habits that would end up running my days and my life. I was filling all the space. I was filling it all. And I think that's where the trouble lies for a lot of people, is when we occupy all of our space with distractions or habits or culture of just whatever happens to be nearby or in front of us, we become unavailable to the people around us, to ourselves, to God. And I think that in the text that Amanda read from Ephesians, the distraction around the church was the danger there too. Now, Ephesus, the text she read was from Ephesians, Paul's letter to the Ephesians. So this was the early church in Ephesus, the early church, just barely removed from ground zero, Jesus and his disciples. And Ephesus in modern-day Turkey was a bustling port city. Greco-Roman culture everywhere. And it was full of commerce. And if you're familiar with the seven wonders of the ancient world, this is also where the temple of Artemis was. And Artemis was the Greek god of the hunt and the wild. And so this was a huge city with a large revolving population. And so you can imagine a city like Las Vegas or even like Panama City Beach in the 90s. So you've got a lot of people who don't always live in this place that are there, and they probably also don't behave the same way they behave at home while they're there. And so this was what it was like to be in Ephesus. And so for the early church, when Christianity was the minority and when it was in its infancy, you can imagine how easy it is just to take whatever is around you as normal, as this is the world, and sort of be absorbed into it and absorb it into yourself. And I think that tended to leave them unavailable for God's purposes for the early church if they would let themselves be absorbed like that. So what's Paul saying in the text? Let's look at it. So in chapter 5, verse 15, Paul says, "Be careful then how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise." And that feels like pretty solid advice in any situation, right? It feels like Paul is maybe giving a nod to the Proverbs. If you've read the Proverbs, it's full of information about wisdom. The wise one does this, the foolish one does this, and Proverbs often personifies wisdom in a beautiful way. And so maybe he's giving a nod to the Proverbs there. And then he goes on and he says, "Making the most of time because the days are evil." Okay. So he's pointing to the possibility of redeeming time, and he says the days are evil. And that part, I was kind of scratching my head, maybe curious and also a little uncomfortable. What does he mean here? And so I decided I was going to go and look at the original Greek and do a little digging on that. So when Paul says making the most of time because the days are evil, it's really just 4 Greek words. He says the phrase or the word that gets translated into making the most is exagorozomenoi. I'm not going to ask you to say it, but it means redeeming or buying up, and in a commerce setting, it would have been like snatching up a deal before it gets away. And then when he says time, there's 2 different Greek words that gets translated into time. One is chronos. That's when we're talking about minutes and seconds and days, hours. But he uses the word kairos, which is when we're talking about time, that's more like decisive, timely opportunities, God-given opportunities. And so that's the word he uses that gets translated into time here. And when he says the days, he could have been talking about 24-hour periods, but often the word himairai, which was used here, that gets translated into days, he's talking about the age we live in. And then evil, the word that gets translated to evil is ponerai, which can mean kind of a spectrum of things. It usually gets translated to evil in our Bible, but in the Greek, it could mean anything from evil on one end to troublesome or full of hardship. So there's kind of a spectrum of meaning there. And so my take on what he's getting at here is be wise and redeem the God-given moments before they get away, because the age we live in is troublesome or evil or full of hardship. So he points to being present in the moment, even though there are distractions everywhere. When we look at Ephesians, Paul spends the first half, if we look at the whole book, the whole letter, Paul spends the first half in theology. What Jesus did, who Jesus was, who God is, who Christ is, what Christ does. And then the second half, which is where we are in chapter 5, he talks about a lot of rules, instructions, and warnings for the church. But I found it helpful to look back at the closing part of the first half in his theology, where he closes this section with a prayer for the church, and that I think provides some context on what he's getting at here. So in Ephesians chapter 3, 18 and 19, Paul prays this prayer. He says, "I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God." Let's leave that one up for a sec. So if you look at this, there's a little bit of a paradox here, because he says to know a love that surpasses knowledge. So Paul's not praying for the church to think our way into God or think our way into our faith. I think Paul's praying for the church to encounter God's love and presence at a level that's deeper than intellect. And Paul's praying that the church would be filled, not just informed. And I think this prayer in chapter 3 really sets the foundation and gives context to the instructions he gives in chapter 5, where he talks about redeeming and seizing time. He's talking about living in a way that makes us present and available, not distracted, and available to be filled with God's fullness. And I think to be filled with God's fullness, we have to make space. We have to be ready to empty ourselves. If there's no space in our lives, there's no space for God to fill. So, how do we create space? How do we empty ourselves to be present and available? I don't have a one-size-fits-all prescription, but I can tell you what has worked in my life. In my low point that I talked about a few minutes ago, I found myself driving. I had about 30 minutes in front of me in the car, and I was feeling low. I knew I was feeling low, and I thought maybe if I talk about this, it'll just help. And so I pulled out I asked my digital assistant to open my voice memos app, and I just pressed record and started talking while I was driving. And after a few minutes, I started to open up, and I started hearing myself say things that I wasn't aware that I thought or felt, because I'd never articulated them before. And I think there's something profound about taking these feelings and thoughts and kind of amorphous things that are in our heads or in our spirit and speaking or writing them into being, into a concrete form that is a beautiful thing. And I think it reminds me of God speaking the world into being, giving it form in Genesis. And I immediately just felt when I heard myself saying my feelings and my thoughts, it created space here. And it allowed me to have perspective on the thing that was going on in here, which was now I felt like I could observe and look at a little bit. And so that was really the first step for me, and it kind of opened a door. And I heard one of the things I heard myself say was, well, there's all these things that you can't control: the pandemic, the change and uncertainty in the church, the death of my dog. Maybe it stands to reason that if I focus on the things that I can control, maybe I'll feel different. And it was like a door opened, and I was giving myself permission to start naming things. And so I immediately, within a moment, just started thinking of things. Well, what do I have control over? Well, the food and drink that I put into my body, the way I move my body, the sleep that I get. I have all four of those areas I have almost complete control over. And having that focus in the days, weeks, and months going forward helped me create more space within myself and helped me be more available to people around me. And so, but it started with having that perspective. And for me, it was what I would now refer to as voice journaling, like just getting it out of here and making it into a concrete form. And the second step came after weeks or months and sort of reflecting back to that moment and realizing that when I was in the car driving, talking, I was in solitude. I had no exterior voices. It was just me and God and my thoughts and feelings. And I think, and that's the definition of solitude, by the way. It's being alone with one's thoughts and feelings with no external voices. And so, and that was, I'd never thought of that, but that means no podcasts, no TV, not even a book. Like, these are all external voices, right? So it's solitude if it's just you and God. And creating more of those moments in my life really set the tone for the space that I was creating in my life. And once I started to do that, the realization came to me that there was this next step that was creating maybe a holy space through stillness. And so when you find solitude, it means that you've already been intentional about quieting the noise from other people's voices. And some people say, I can't do that in my life. I've heard people say that. And I just want to challenge you a little bit, right? To find solitude, you can wake up before everyone else does. You could go to bed after everyone else does. You could go eat your lunch in the car. There are opportunities. But the third space was finding stillness. So we've been intentional about quieting the noise from external voices. So stillness was for me about quieting the inner chatter. If you're like me, you grew up in the Western Christian church or culture, you learned what prayer is. And I think there's kind of a missing piece here. I learned that prayer is talking. Prayer is either talking in my head or talking out loud or being in a group of people where someone is talking and the rest of the group is, resonating, listening along with that. And that's true. That is prayer, and that is important, and I think God is always listening. But I think that's only part of prayer. And I think the Western church has kind of failed largely at the other half. The Eastern church has kind of held on to this in a better way, I think. But I want you to imagine for just a moment that, imagine one of your close relationships, okay? Or you can make one up. But I want you to imagine that when you want to connect with this other person, you go to them and you tell them how you're feeling, what you've been thinking, and you tell them how you feel about them, and you thank them for what they've done, and you walk away. Until the next time you want to connect with them. And you go to them again, and you tell them how you're feeling, what you've been thinking about, where you've failed, all about your life, and you maybe ask some favors, and you thank them for what they've done, and you walk away. It's when you're imagining a relationship with another person, it's kind of easy to see that regardless of the motivation and the love that you have there, that sometimes that relationship can maybe feel a bit one-sided. And I think that God gives us the instruction for the other half of prayer when God says, "Be still and know that I am God." And that's been a slow realization for me that I've been integrating into my life. But for me, it looks like starting with that first half of prayer, that getting perspective, speaking or thinking or writing down my prayers, my thoughts, my feelings. And then I try to let the inner chatter quiet down. And then I try to just be an observer to what's going on inside me and just be present and be aware. And I've learned that when I do this, I look at the world differently afterward. And I've had to block it out on my calendar. I find that solitude time, and I just block it out like it's a meeting, and that's what works for me. For me, it's like right after everybody gets to school, right after everybody gets to work, before I start the day. And it's given me a lot of insight on what's going on inside of me, and I've learned a lot about myself and about my relationship with God through this. And I didn't develop this sermon, this message, to make it as if I'm like the hero of the story that has the answers, okay? I happen to be an expert in the experience of Andrew Henderson, and so this is what has been fruitful in my life. But my life's not the template for you, and I get that. But this cycle of solitude and perspective and stillness, through this, I've been just developing an awareness of what God's doing in me. And through this, I've been made more available and more aware of the people around me and what God is trying to do in my life, in the world around me, through me. And so it feels like good news, and I'm excited to share it. So my life's not the template here, but I think if we are looking for a life that is the template for us to model ours after, we can't do any better than the life of Jesus. And you notice that in Jesus' ministry, through all the Gospels, intertwined in teaching, preaching, healing, being with people, intertwined here, he was stealing away for perspective and stillness and solitude with God. And that's not where he lived. He didn't live in that place, but it's a balance and it's a place for renewal. And I think when we empty ourselves, it is a potential for new life, for new things to be born in us from seeds that God plants. It's like a resurrection moment in our lives. So I pose the question, where can we make space in our lives so that we can allow ourselves to be filled and renewed by God?